and we're live, I think. There's a slight delay, so I'm just going to fill the void of the internet as this live stream starts to connect on, but hopefully people can start to see us. And I I see someone already wishing happy religious neutrality in the chat, saying, finally, there's a sensible day once a year.
And a very neutral neutrality day to you as well, our friend. Ian and I were discussing the appropriate greeting for Neutrality Day. By the way, happy Neutrality Day to all the folks who are joining us on the live stream as well. And we actually, as a newer holiday, we are probably going to have to punch up a couple of ideas on the proper greeting. But I do like a neutral Neutrality Day to you. But also happy Neutrality Day, I think works because I think we're all happier when we have a state where it respects neutrality and when it comes to religion.
And that's, I think, the thing we'll keep coming back to through our discussion today is neutrality, religious neutrality day is not about a forced neutrality. It's about a space where the government isn't trying to coerce you to believe or not believe anything, but giving you freedom and the space to be your authentic individual self, whether that's a humanist or atheist like we are, or even if you are a religious person, you have that right to be who you are
Yeah.
and believe what you want.
And neutrality is all about abstention, right? So we're going to talk a lot about this in today's live stream, but it's about the state not taking a position on these things. And as you said, Ian, giving people the space to do their thing. I think a lot of times people think of separation of religion and government, and that's a thing that happens in the states as codified by their laws, but it's translated into the state's duty of religious neutrality here in Canada. And that manifests itself in a way of allowing us to be, yeah, the state just gets out of the way and lets people do their thing.
So, we have a lot to talk about today. We have just released a new report called Lost in Translation from Laïcité to True Religious Neutrality. But before we even get into that, we want to give a little bit of a detail about what Religious Neutrality Day is and how we came to invent a holiday. But I think the first thing we have to do is introduce ourselves.
Of
So, my
course.
name is Ian Bushfield. I'm the executive director of the BC Humanist Association, the one who sends all the emails. But we are hoping to grow our team in the coming weeks and months and into the future.
And I'm Dr. Teal Phelps Blondroff. I'm the research coordinator for the BC Humanist Association. I do a lot of other things, but I help coordinate our amazing team of volunteer researchers that do work across a wide range of issues relating to the separation of religion and government, state neutrality, and a whole lot more.
So, the BC Humanist Association created this holiday last year. Last year was the 10-year anniversary of the Movement like Québécois versus Saguenay decision of the Supreme Court of Canada. And we wanted to recognize that because for the past number of years, we've been working on something we call the Saguenay Project. Before we get into all of that, maybe let's walk through a little bit of the fast summary of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision. You've read this many times, Teal, and written summaries of it. So I'll turn it over to you to give
I
that
have, yes,
walkthrough.
no, and as Ian mentioned, we've been slowly studying this over the past many years. And so, what Saguenay was it was a court case involving municipal councils opening with prayer. In fact, the municipal council of Saguenay, Quebec, Alain Simoneau, a resident in Saguenay, was regularly attending council meetings, and he witnessed the mayor opening meetings with a prayer and crossing himself, and he was joined by other members of the council. He raised concerns about this because he felt uncomfortable. Of course, municipal council meetings are places where everyone should be welcome. I should also add, I didn't mention this in my introduction, but when I'm not helping with the BC Humanist Research Team, I'm also a municipal councillor in the district of Saanich, so I attend all of our regular council meetings, and we always want to try and make people feel welcome in those meetings. And one can imagine that if a meeting is opening with the prayer of one specific religion and one specific sect within that religion, people who don't belong to that religion or who are of different sects or who just support governments being neutral would feel wildly unwelcome in that space. And Elaine Simoneau pursued this case. It worked its way through the courts. There's a longer story and saga there, but I think that is a bit too much detail for today. But ultimately, it ended up at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court explored the issue of can a municipal council meeting in Canada open with prayer? And the Supreme Court ruled definitively that no, it cannot. And there's a couple of really key elements here. The first one, and this is, I think, underscores everything we're talking about, the courts described the state as having a duty of religious neutrality. So when it comes to religion, the state should neither support one or another religion or one sect within the religion or religion over non-religion. And so the state has a duty of religious neutrality. And that's translated into abstention. There's a line from the Supreme Court ruling where this court say, what is true neutrality? True neutrality is abstention, not taking a position on such matters. Opening a municipal council meeting with prayer is the exact opposite of that. It's overtly endorsing one religion over others, but it also endorses religion over non-religion, which necessarily excludes non-religious people. And so the Supreme Court was also really clear in saying that this is a democratic imperative. This isn't just a nice to have. The state has to be neutral when it comes to religion. Otherwise, our democracy doesn't function. Effectively, you can imagine, otherwise, the state would be putting its thumb on the scales, again, in favor of one religion over others, and that doesn't make an equal playing field for a democracy to function. And so ultimately, in Canada, you shouldn't be having prayer at the beginning of a municipal council meeting. What's interesting, too, and this is what started our Saguenay project, but the Saguenay project was an investigation into compliance with the Supreme Court ruling. So what happened was the process worked its way through the courts, and finally, in April 15th, 2015, we have a ruling by the Supreme Court, the Saguenay decision. Now, obviously, it takes a little bit of time for municipalities to update their procedures. I know our municipality, I think we still have a rule in our books that prohibits blasphemy in parks, Ian. So, and that's been around for quite a while, and we just haven't got around to updating it. But what our organization then did was we set up a research team to look into, well, are municipalities actually following the law? The Supreme Court was very clear. And so we launched the Saguenay Project. This has been a multi-year project. Our first report came out in 2020, and it looked at British Columbia, compliance in British Columbia municipalities. And we've been working our way across the country, looking at each province in turn. Obviously, we're the BC Humanist Association, so our focus has been on British Columbia. But at the same time, we wanted to see just how compliant municipalities are with this really important Supreme Court ruling. And the results have been very interesting. I guess, Ian, maybe I can talk a bit more about the general results of the Saguenay project. And I think the plan here is to kind of contextualize where we're moving. But ultimately, when we did a survey in British Columbia, we found 26 municipalities in 2018 opened their inaugural meetings with prayer. An inaugural meeting is the meeting that directly or generally follows an election where new councillors are sworn in. There's a mayor's address, there's pipers, there's pomp, there's circumstance, there's indigenous content, and there's sometimes prayer. And what we found in British Columbia, this is 3 years after Saguenay, 2018, 26 municipalities opened their inaugural meetings with prayer. None of the regular meetings, these are sort of daily or weekly or monthly meetings, opened with prayer, so that was fortunate. But that was not a good sign. That was a significant percentage of municipalities opening with prayer. That's of 162 municipalities, by the way, in British Columbia. When we surveyed across the country, we'll also notice that there tends to be sort of a smaller number of municipalities that open their meetings with prayer. Inaugural meetings tend to have more prayer than regular meetings, and that's generally because what we suspect, there's a couple of reasons. One, of course, is that inaugural meetings have more pomp and circumstance. There's pipers, there's a singing of the national anthem, there's town criers in some cases. So sometimes people just want to add more elements, and prayer sometimes works its way in. And what we found was regular council meetings tend to have fewer instances of prayer, but it's not zero. In Manitoba, we found 6 inaugural meetings out of 101 that opened with prayer. This is in 2022, our publication. Ontario was probably the most egregious. Our 2018 analysis looked at every municipality, 328, and of them, 156 opened with prayer. That is an overt violation of the Supreme Court ruling, and as a result, the Constitution. And one of the good things I would point out is that our work here in British Columbia has been impactful. So in 2018, we had 26 municipalities out of 162 open with prayer, their inaugural meetings. 2022 was our last round of municipal elections here in British Columbia, and we identified only 7 municipalities that opened their inaugural meetings with prayer. But something happened between 2018 and 2022. Ian, maybe you could tell us a bit more about what we did, what the BC Humanists did to bring that number down to 7 and ultimately to 0 in its most following that round of inaugurals.
Yeah, it's a round of continued and ongoing advocacy. It's the reason we named one of our reports, we yelled at them until they stopped, is it involved just emails and following up and chasing each of these. Some of the municipalities were very quick to change processes and, have a quick internal meeting where they passed a resolution to say they will not include prayers in all future meetings. Now, that could be overturned by any future council, but they'd have to go against staff recommendations to violate the law. And in a couple cases, notably the cities of Vancouver and Parksville, we had to bring in legal counsel to go back and forth for a couple months with the threat of litigation to determine whether or not the prayers that were included at the inaugural ceremonies of those two municipalities were constitutional or not. And eventually they both conceded that they were not constitutional and they won't do it again. And all of this kind of underlined the importance of us taking Saguenay from this decision of the Supreme Court of Canada and kind of breathing life into it, because there aren't police for the Constitution, right? It's up to individual citizens to assert their collective rights and challenge unconstitutional laws. A lot of people will tell us secularism or the separation of church and state isn't in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It isn't in the Constitution of Canada, but that's just not true. It's not written explicitly, but the Supreme Court's jurisprudence is very well established through Saguenay and earlier cases and cases ongoing that we have this duty, or the governments have this duty, to be neutral on terms of religion. And
Well,
that's why we've gone forward into bringing this into a whole day.
Well, and also, like, just to reinforce what you're saying, Ian, the advocacy work that the BC Humanist Association does is critical. First of all, because no one else is doing it. Just because there's a Supreme Court ruling doesn't mean there are police enforcing it. But also the other aspect, which is just the power imbalances of, the do that in a small town kind of mentality. One of the things that it's kind of a bit of flipping the book. We get to be the big city bad atheists who are writing a letter to a small municipality asking them to please follow the law. But in small towns, imagine you're in a small place like Belcara or Lumbee, and you might be the only out atheist or not out as a non-religious, a non-believer in that community. And so attending a municipal council meeting, there's already a power imbalance between elected officials and non-elected people. And now you're adding another layer, which is asking someone to stand up in a community and loudly challenge their council to follow the Constitution. And that often is a very challenging position for someone to be in. And so the advocacy work that we do is so impactful. And the Supreme Court ruling was so clear. Like, one of my favorite moments on our many year journey of this is when the municipality of Vancouver, their lawyers eventually wrote back to us to apologize for, not to apologize, but to acknowledge that Ken Sim opened the last Vancouver inaugural meeting with 5 prayers. And I think their response was one sentence long, and it was something along the lines of, "We admit that we violated the state's duty of religious neutrality by including prayer in this meeting." Full stop, one sentence. It's pretty definitive. And so I think what happens is when municipal lawyers are presented with this case, they're just like, no, no, the Constitution is very clear. The Saguenay decision is very clear. You can't do this thing. But often that advocacy work that we do is so important because things just sort of sit there until someone challenges them. And that's quite important in that respect. For folks who are interested, the Saguenay project is still ongoing. We've got reports on British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and PEI. At the end of the month, we have our report on New Brunswick coming out. We've got Nova Scotia on the way, Newfoundland and Labrador. The data is being crunched. And then we have a second report coming out for Ontario very soon. Ontario has an election coming up in the fall, 2026. And we've been doing a lot of advocacy since then. Since 2018, when there was 156 municipalities, that number has dropped significantly. Due, again, to our advocacy work. So we'll be releasing that report prior to the Ontario elections. And then post-election, we'll be doing mop-up. And this is kind of the way that the advocacy works. And this is going to, I think, dovetail well into our conversation about Neutrality Day in general. But what we do is, after an election, we review all the minutes of the inaugural meetings following that election to see who has prayer. And if any municipality has prayer, those municipalities will have already received a letter from us, a polite letter from Ian, maybe 2, maybe 3. And so then if they still have prayer many years, 11 years after the Saguenay decision, they'll receive a letter from one of our amazing pro bono legal team members, who will then encourage them to desist from that project process. And so the advocacy work is research advocacy. We do the work, we find the data, and then we're able to follow through on it. And I think that's really important. But obviously, the Saguenay project and the Neutrality Day holiday isn't just about municipal prayer, because the concept of state neutrality, as identified in the Saguenay decision, isn't just about not opening meetings with prayer. It's about so much more. So, Ian, tell me a bit more about how we celebrate Neutrality Day, I guess. And
Well,
this is a broader question, I guess.
yeah, like one of the other things that came up while we were monitoring municipalities is you start to see lots of different ways that aren't necessarily opening with a prayer that religion and government mix. And some are clear cut like this, and some are a bit more fuzzy. So, for example, we see a lot of examples of municipalities where the mayor or council, and this will happen provincially and federally, will go to prayer breakfasts. Sometimes those are privately organized, and they're just events like any other community event where the politicians get invited to. Sometimes they're encouraged to speak. And sometimes they're recognized on the municipality's website, and that gives a little air of legitimacy to them. The National Prayer Breakfast in Ottawa, for example, has been organized by the joint offices of the Speakers of House of Commons and the Senate, which does lend it an air of legitimacy or at least state involvement. And Mark Carney spoke at that, the same as Justin Trudeau has spoken at past ones and Stephen Harper before him. I don't know if any prime ministers haven't. There were MPs from all parties. There was, I think, Gord Johns was the NDP MP. Actually, I don't think anyone from the Bloc was there. I'll give them credit for that. But Elizabeth May is a prominent speaker at these. And, one of our members raised that Carney used the crest of Canada at this, and that potentially violates the protocol of how that can be used because it's mixing the, official office of government with a religious event. But one of the other things that's come up is a lot of municipalities will issue proclamations. And one of the common ones we've seen over the last couple of years in December is this push for December to be declared Christian Heritage Month. Now, there's Islamic Heritage Months, Sikh Heritage Months, and a lot of others. And to some extent, we don't oppose any of these as long as they are all treated equally, right? As long as they all have equal opportunity. And then the kind of question is, what are they hoping to gain here? But that's a broader discussion. And we said, well, we just need to remind all of these municipalities that religious neutrality is important. We found one municipality, I think it was Cobourg, Ontario, one individual atheist in that municipality was quite disappointed that his community declared December Christian Heritage Month a couple years ago. So he brought forward an Atheist Awareness Day proclamation, which they initially rejected. And that's problematic, right?
Yeah.
To say we recognize Christian Heritage Month, but we won't recognize Atheist Day. And he actually got his council to rescind the Christian Heritage Month proclamation
Well,
through that advocacy.
yeah, and the approach we're taking, and I think that's important. Obviously, that puts a lot of pressure on one person. An individual activist, again, potentially in a small town, sticking their neck out there to fight for what's right. And so, what we've done with Neutrality Day is kind of a bit different, insofar as we've created a national holiday that kind of stands in as a reinforcement of the importance of neutrality. And like you said, Ian, so the idea is you reach out to your local municipality. If they've acknowledged these other days, then they should acknowledge Neutrality Day. But if they don't, then you have viewpoint discrimination where they're favoring some views over others. I mean, obviously, I guess one option is to be completely neutral and not recognize any religious days. It does get complicated because some days are both religious and cultural, and you can see it gets a bit muddy. And when you're trying to talk about how do we celebrate diversity in our communities, there's different ways of doing that. And there's a really interesting and rich conversation there. But ultimately, if a municipality is choosing to endorse, support, recognize any of these individual holidays, then they should also be recognizing Neutrality Day. And it's also just one day, by the way. I mean, Christian Heritage Month is a whole month. We're just asking for one day. We should be neutral all days of the year, of course, but it's just one recognition, which I think is quite important. I want to just one other thing, Ian, just to kind of expand why this is important, because a lot of times sometimes people will say, look, this is just symbolic. Opening a meeting with a prayer, having the prime minister attend a religious event, using the crest officially. These are symbolic things that don't have any tangible impact on people's lives. I want to take a quick pause to talk about how that's not the case, how these symbolic elements that we we incorporate into our meetings don't just exclude people, which is in and of itself a tangible thing, but also have an impact on state policy. From the perspective of excluding people, what I would say here is, as a city councilor, I see people presenting at the microphone weekly, and most of those people, it's often the only time they'll talk to government directly. It's one of the great things about municipal politics. In fact, you get to talk to people directly. But of course, it's also a very kind of anxious, anxiety-inducing situation. You are presenting on a live stream to a big, circular table of city councilors sitting there looking stern. People are super nervous. Anything that makes it harder for someone to stand up and share their views at a local government level or any level of government, quite frankly, is something we want to dissuade. We want to encourage people to be sharing with government, and it shouldn't be, people from this religion are welcome. People from other religions are guests in this space. And that was kind of one of the cruxes of the Saguenay decision. But it's so much more than symbolic. Ian, some of the stuff that we look at around tax policy and bubble policy, they're more tangible. Could you speak a bit to that about the tangible impacts of when states violate their duty of religious neutrality?
I'm actually going to defer that because we're going to talk about that as we get into this report that we're going
Oh, perfect. Yeah,
to
of
go
course. Yeah.
to in depth in a few minutes. But I think one of the things that's come up with neutrality is we see this weaponization of terms happen, particularly from the far right, where
Mhm.
they will adopt progressive language to try to squeeze in reactionary agendas. We saw this with like parental rights or vaccine choice, presented as though they are inherent good things, even though they are undermining the rights of children or public health and safety. And over the last couple of years, we've started to see that happen with neutrality. A number of municipalities in the province of Alberta, for example, have adopted neutrality bylaws, which sounds great until you realize it's just about banning pride crosswalks. And what we'll really get into in a minute is the entire province of Quebec. Its approach to laïcité is a forced neutrality, a homogenization, which is one of the things the Supreme Court of Canada actually spoke against in the Saguenay decision. But let's start with Alberta since we're
Yeah.
both homeboys of that
Well,
fair
and just
province.
just a yes, yeah, the yes and you on that. I think as someone who works in reproductive justice in one of my other positions, you could definitely see that my body, my choice rhetoric being adopted by the anti-vax community, and we see this time and time again. So in Alberta, a couple of things that have come up. I think the first one you mentioned, actually the first one that you flagged, if I might be so bold, was around pride flags and legislation prohibiting the flying of pride flags or pride crosswalks. And this is often, occasionally, I get correspondence about this. Actually, in my capacity as a member of our local library board, we got some letters about people being upset that we were endorsing the religion of pride by putting up pride flags and telling people that they're welcome in the library. And so, as you were saying, people kind of try to subvert the rhetoric of the left to say, well, this is a religion, this is an ideology. And I think it's worth noting, and folks who are following this live stream should already know this, of course, but no, telling people that everyone is welcome here, regardless of their gender, their identity, their religion, their race, etc., is not exclusionary. It's not an ideology. It's simply indicating that people are welcome here. And I always find this kind of interesting when people try to conflate things like supporting Pride and being an ally to the LGBTQ plus community as religion, because they seem to want to then defame, like, say religion is a bad thing. It's kind of one of those own goal situations, right? Where someone's like, oh, if you think religion is bad and you have a religion, and you're like, well, that doesn't help your case out either. But what you see is this attempt to try to frame things like celebrating Pride as a religion, and therefore, falling under the umbrella of state neutrality. And the one that I was going to ask you about, Ian, was just sort of the school policies, because I know there's an active bill in Alberta right now. Obviously, the individual municipalities have gotten in trouble or have caused a stir around banning pride crosswalks and things like that. Um, Incidentally, if anyone has any questions about pride crosswalks and colorful crosswalks being less safe for drivers, it's exactly the opposite. I have a research paper I've been working on road murals and how they actually reduce vehicular speeds by 4 kilometers an hour. So that argument is also a very bad one. But Bill 25 in Alberta is the act to remove politics and ideology from the classrooms and amend the Education Act. This is an old acquaintance of mine, Demetrios, the Minister of Education in Alberta, who's been cutting a swath of interesting actions and policies across the province. What is this policy? What is this legislation doing, Ian?
Well, you mentioned the minister Dimitrios Nicolaides. Apologies for the mispronunciation there, probably. We called him out in December for issuing a message to all parents for the year end, which was his very Christian Christmas message, where he praised Jesus. And I don't have the language in front of me, but it went beyond a simple have a happy holidays or even Merry Christmas to like, this is the reason for all of the freedoms you have kind of language. And it offended quite a few people who thought that was an inappropriate use of the government resources. I'll come back to the bill in a second, but I just want to really emphasize, I'm going to keep hammering on this throughout our discussion, that one of the key aspects, as I read the Saguenay decision, is religious neutrality is important because it's about preventing the government from coercing you to believe or not believe something, right? So the um, existence of religious people is not coercion. It does, it's sort of like the pride rainbow, whether it's a flag or a crosswalk, that's not making you gay unless your sexuality is so fragile that just learning you might be able to be attracted to someone of the same gender uh, will let you go that way. But that's more an issue that I think you need to work on than one
Mm,
that needs to be restricted from the government. And that's kind of the issue we'll get into it with Quebec, with like the appearance of religion is offensive to secularism, and we don't believe that's true. Here in Alberta, what we see with the ideology and classroom bill is an effort to suppress discussion in favor of some kind of false neutrality, right?
mhm.
The bill is trying to do a lot of different things. It's banning schools from raising any flags that aren't the Alberta or Canada flag. So it does that kind of, we can't recognize the diversity of our schools. It's also really trying to put it on teachers to, and this is the minister's words, be neutral and impartial in their own personal views. But what does that actually mean? Like he's talking about making sure both sides of debates are being accurately represented, whether it's in history or science or anything of political significance. But this is the kind of bullshit language that was used in the creationist fights
Yes.
in Dover, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, where some debates are settled
Yeah, there's
and
not both
pretending they
sides.
aren't is not neutral.
I don't know about you, our family was glued to the Artemis II space expedition, and one of the things that I thought was really funny was the flat earthers who are freaking out and are actively cooking conspiracy theories as they're watching a spaceship rotate, circle the moon. And your point, I think, was really worth underscoring, which is no, some debates are settled, and in a sense, the desire to have both sides of an issue, it actually creates a debate where there isn't one because it's settled. I'm thinking climate change. I'm thinking, um, classic questions about like basic science questions. Is the Earth round? That isn't something where you can present both sides. Evolution. These are settled science. And so ultimately, you see this attempt to create this both sides argument. The point I would phrase here is, what is the neutral position, right? Now, in Saguenay, the neutral position is abstention. But one of the points that you were raising was like how, and maybe as someone who has been a teacher before as well, you can't really be fully neutral on everything, on anything, really. Like, in a sense, your own personal perspectives will always somewhat color what you're looking at, especially when it comes to things that are subjective. When it comes to hard science, we can both agree climate change is a thing, the Earth is round, and evolution exists and, is a natural process. But at the same time, um, when it comes to, oh, I lost the train of my thought here. We were talking,
Neutrality in education and
yeah,
curriculum.
neutrality in education, right? Yeah, sorry. But one of the problems, of course, is like who the teacher is what's being targeted here as well by Demetrios and Alberta. So, for example, I'm thinking of you were talking about the prayer breakfast. Well, Elizabeth May, she's a member of Parliament for just up here in the island here in Saanich Gulf Islands, and she has a very prominent cross necklace that she wears. It's in all of her leaflets. She's always wearing it, and that's part of her religious identity. She is Christian. I don't know which sect. And if someone was to say wear a headscarf or a turban, like Jagmeet Singh, the former leader of the federal NDP, that's part of who they are and their personal religious identity. So when Jagmeet stands up, he's not proselytizing by wearing a turban. And when Elizabeth May is standing up, she's not proselytizing by wearing a cross. But when they start proselytizing and using their position in office to spread their religion and faith, that would be a violation of the duty of religious neutrality. The distinction is, one is a religious person existing in society, the other one is someone using the power and levers of the state to promote their religion over others. And it's really ironic that Demetrios has their legislation trying to remove politics and ideology from the classroom when, as you mentioned, his holiday letter was overtly Christian in nature, talking about the birth of Jesus Christ being the cornerstone of faith and literally referring to the incarnation of Christ. It's not a generic letter recognizing that some members of our community are celebrating Christmas and it's a religious holiday for them. It's quite literally proselytizing. So there's a bit of deep irony there. And it's, to me, the issue is using the power of the state to spread your religion as opposed to just existing as a religious person in our society or a non-religious person for that
The
matter.
irony is so much deeper than that, Teal, because this bill isn't just about one or two things. It is an omnibus act, and just trying to get your head around it, even from like the news coverage, because we're not an Alberta group and we haven't delved super deep into this. But this bill covers a lot of different aspects that require things like The education minister gets a lot more authority over setting school authorities' priorities, allowing them to waive criteria for charter schools, uh, of reversing a previous requirement for external presenters on sexual health education, gender identity, and sexual orientation to be pre-approved by government, but only for religious instruction. And then so like you combine all of this and it's centralizing power in the minister, which is a deeply ideological decision,
Yeah.
just as much as deferring it to the school boards. Like ideology is everything. Pretending you can be neutral on ideology is nonsense. And the better approach is to teach critical thinking, right? To really try to ensure that students learn how to understand the milieu that they're living in, critically assess it, and determine whether they like it or not freely.
Mhm.
And that's something at its best, I think the BC curriculum tries to do. Whether it is effective or not is a big debate outside our purview today. But this kind of approach Alberta is taking is really centralized in the minister and based on this kind of belief that school is about teaching facts and not like teaching thinking.
No, I think that's absolutely critical, and this is also why some people will go through the entire school system believing that science is definitive rather than science being a process. And I think that's you can actually see the outcome of this in our society today, right? Where people are unable to critically evaluate things, and with things like the rise of AIs and deep fakes and misinformation and disinformation, it's so critical. I mean, this is also a broader question around like education. Sometimes there's conversation around religious and philosophy education in schools as a class, and one of the things that comes up in those contexts is how do teachers present and teach religion in class? Like not religion as in we're teaching you the religion, we're teaching you about religion. But of course, there's so many biases inherent in that. So a lot of times, for example, if you and I were to design, well, we're bad examples because we know all this stuff, but if the average person was to design a curriculum teaching, introducing someone to the religions of the world, it would maybe focus on some of the more prominent religions. But of course, why do we give credence to a religion that's more prominent? You know, why are we talking about Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and maybe Buddhism, but not talking about Eckankar or Scientology or, FLDS sects, at the Crick. And so I think it's one of those things where it's really hard to do. And when you see the government trying to put their fingers in the scale in the way that Demetrios is doing, it's even worse because it's kind of overt. But it's a classic challenge. And I think the point you made was the strongest, which is the way that we navigate this space is to teach people critical thinking and philosophy and like rhetoric and how to structure good arguments. I was an old debate coach, and we used to teach students the fallacies, the both formal and informal fallacies. And once you know those, you can see so many fallacious arguments on a daily basis. And in fact, the first few years of being a new debate student, you become very obnoxious because you know the Latin names for all the fallacies, and you're like, that was a reductio ad absurdum. And of course, eventually you learn not to use the Latin terms because it's kind of obnoxious over time. But so, I mean, what's interesting that we see in Alberta is this attempt for neutrality, but the neutrality is kind of being subverted in a sense of spreading sort of the UCP's sort of more Christian right ideology. But maybe I can take us over to Quebec then, because in Quebec we have a different type of secularism. I think you and I have now talked about this for quite a while. And for folks who are joining us, we're the BC Humanist Association, and today is Neutrality Day. So a neutral neutrality day to all of you. And if you have any questions about the stuff we're talking about, please put them in the comments. Ian is monitoring those and he'll bring them up. We're really happy to have you here. And if you're interested in supporting the work that we do, we'll make sure that there's links available to you. Please support the work of the BC Humanist Association. The vast majority of our research team are amazing volunteers. And as we've already heard, the work that we do is making an impact. We've reduced the number of municipalities across Canada that are violating the Constitution, that are violating the Saguenay decision. And it's also worth looking back at what we've done as we look forward to what we want to, where we're headed. Where we're headed is Quebec, Ian. So let's jump into Quebec unless there's any questions. I'm going to check in with you on the old question side of things.
We've had a few comments, just people saying hi, someone from Half Moon Bay.
Hmm.
Johnny has given another number of comments in the chat um, about religion and its impacts on the world, and I think it's doesn't like it. It's my understanding, and that's fair enough.
I mean, you
Uh,
can see what happens with neutrality with like speaking of international events, looking at the Middle East, when there's reports that American military units are being told they're fighting a holy war, and we have countries that are run by religious fanatics, that is incredibly worrying because you get the situation wherein you have people who might think that they are bringing upon the apocalypse. And when you have weapons that can actively bring upon the apocalypse in the hands of those people, it becomes very worrying. So I very much feel our friend's comments on that as well. Yeah, I think it's very nerve-wracking. For the longest time, we've had the comment of, well, we don't want countries like Iran to have nuclear weapons because we don't want a religiously motivated country to have access to nuclear weapons. And now we have, a Christian nationalist running the United States running around with nuclear weapons. That's very disconcerting for sure.
And we have another greeting from Saskatchewan. So
Oh, excellent. Our friends from
thanks for checking
Saskatchewan.
in. We don't the one of the challenges is that I don't think there's an active pro-secular group in Saskatchewan right now. There have been in the past. Um, but it's something I know Humanist Canada and Center for Inquiry Canada are deeply interested in, and I encourage you to get involved in any organizing you can because many of the challenges Alberta faces are very similar for you, unfortunately.
And checking in for Saskatchewan for our friends there, we did a report on municipal prayer for Saguenay, not to bring us back to our circle around here, but we found 3 out of 90 municipalities opened their inaugural meetings in the last round of inaugural municipal elections with prayer, and 2 out of 95 opened their regular council meetings with prayer. So if you're in Saskatchewan and interested in getting involved, let us know. Because we don't have a group there on the ground, it's a little bit harder to do the kind of grassroots advocacy that we've been able to do here in British Columbia. So Ian, tell me more. Let's jump across the country from Saskatchewan, hello by the way, to Quebec. And in Quebec, we actually see a really interesting tension within secularism because there's different versions of secularism, and we see a different version manifest in Quebec. And as a political scientist, I can tell folks that when we study Canadian politics or Quebec politics. It's often called ROC, the rest of Canada, or Quebec, because politics are a bit different in Quebec. But different in sometimes better, sometimes worse, depending on the issue we're looking at. And today we're talking about laïcité, which is sort of a French version of secularism, but it's not entirely, it's not the same kind of secularism that we've been talking about just right now. So maybe before we jump into Quebec and talk about Bill 21 and some of the way that laïcité is being attempted to be operationalized in legislation, maybe we could take a step back and just talk about what is laïcité, the concept of secularism in this sort of this French setting.
Yeah, it's a really good time to be talking about this. We were at the Supreme Court of Canada a couple weeks ago in the monumental, historic case challenging Bill 21, as you mentioned. We were there bringing arguments about how we think religious neutrality should be interpreted as a core constitutional principle, an unwritten one, even. And we've been talking and thinking about this internally for a while because we found in August of last year this report came out from a government committee on laïcité. And it was a really interesting and meaty document that had a lot of nuance and one that we wanted to tease out because I think a lot of the English Canada discussion of laïcité in Quebec is quite antagonistic and for good reasons that we'll get into. But that antagonism can miss the things we like, right? We're seculars. We're pro-secular organization that thinks it's really important to challenge religious privilege and the intertwining of church and state. And laïcité fundamentally tries to be about that, right? It is the approach of pulling religion out of government. It, for anyone who knows a little bit about the history of Quebec, it was a deeply Catholic province where they ran the healthcare, education system, and most of social services across society until the mid-late 1960s. And they are dealing with the societal trauma of that. We don't need to go on very long about all of the downsides of the Catholic Church, although it's very funny to watch the schism between American government and the Catholics right now and whose side you weirdly get put on in that. But for Quebec society, there is this challenge of how do we move beyond this? And so they have had a decades-long conversation about religion and government that doesn't formulate the same in English Canada, right? And France has had a similar conversation for similar reasons. And it's taken a different shape than secularism in England and the United Kingdom, where they still have the Lords Spiritual, who are members of the Church of England in their House of Lords, which is highly problematic from most secularists' point of view.
The reason I said French was because a lot of times we see this concept of laïcité coming from France, from the French Revolution, where you have this kind of desire to, and this is we're not going to get deeply into the history here, friends, but this desire to keep state and religion separate. Again, going back to lessons learned from France itself. And so, what like if you were to characterize the different types of secularism, laïcité versus the kind of secularism that is supported by the BC Humanist Association, how would you characterize that, Ian? I know we've often used terms like hard versus soft or sharp. Maybe draw a distinction between those two, and then we can kind of dive into how those operationalize themselves through legislation.
Yeah, in the report we've just released, we kind of tease it out as English Canada's secularism is the open secularism versus laïcité is more closed. One of the ways we try to look at it charitably is laïcité really leans in on, well, they both require a state's duty of religious neutrality, right? They require the government to be neutral and fair and equal. And they also both ask of the government, that separation of church and state. I think the critical difference is within laïcité, and you can see this in writings of advocates for laïcité, is it's not just that the state has to be neutral in practice, but it has to be neutral in appearance.
Hmm.
And so it's not just a matter of government being neutral and not trying to coerce you, but when you look at government, you should not see religion. And that's how we fall into the traps, in our view, of obsessing about religious symbols on government employees, looking at religious symbols in government advertising, and that there's a subtle nuance in there. But ironically, in Quebec, they, for, quite famously for a while, didn't touch the cross in the National Assembly right away. It is gone now, to their credit, and they did the right thing in finally moving that down. But the province still kind of underplays the necessity of changing the names of everything that's a French Catholic saint everywhere. And maybe that's not as important, but it is an irony when you're talking about appearance.
Well, and just to like sort of conceptualize what we're talking about, like open versus closed secularism, sometimes people call it hard versus soft. I think open and closed is probably more descriptive. But the point you were making is really important because what you have is effectively a government that's trying to make a homogenized appearance. And of course, what that means is what is the baseline for that? Well, the baseline is not people who are wearing headscarves, people who are wearing yarmulkes, people who are wearing turbans. It's a sort of homogenized, heteronormative approach. And that necessarily is going to erase and exclude people who are wearing, whose religions require them to wear symbols or various paraphernalia. And so you're basically saying, hey, you are welcome to practice your religion if you want. But if you want to practice your religion as you would like to, you just can't work for government, or you just can't be a teacher, or you can't run a child care facility. And that becomes problematic because you're effectively excluding people based on their beliefs. It's not neutrality anymore. You're now closing people's opportunities off just because of their religious beliefs. And this is always interesting where we as humanists we stand in solidarity and as allies to members of religious minorities who just want to practice their religions as they would. Obviously, we're not religious, so we don't believe in those religions, but they should be allowed to practice their religions as they would. We want the state to be neutral, and when the state isn't neutral, it's favoring one religion versus another, but it can also be simply closing the door to people who are of certain religious traditions and saying you don't belong here, or if you want to belong here, you have to violate your own personal beliefs by removing religious paraphernalia that you believe is required by your deity.
Yeah, we draw this out as like the contradiction that's within laïcité, which is, as we write, the government is attempting to claim neutrality even as it's actively intervening in citizens' personal expression. So it's moving from having this um, emphasis on neutrality and this requirement into and avoiding coercion into coercion, right? It is telling people what not to wear instead of just letting them wear or not.
And this comes up a lot with, like, just to bring it back to our very first part of the conversation on Saguenay. It's a distinction I often find I have to explain to folks, and it makes sense because it can be a bit complicated. But when it comes to opening a municipal council meeting with a prayer, when you're doing that as, say, a mayor or a city councilor, or you're inviting a guest, the state is giving special time for religion in that meeting. So if I was to open I'm a Saanich councilor, every Saanich meeting with a prayer, the state is saying we are going to favor this religion or religion in general over non-religion or other religions by giving it special time at the meeting, by endorsing it officially through the state. However, if as a city councilor, I feel that I'm inspired by my deity to oppose a housing development on the corner of 5th and Main, I could mention that in my speech. That wouldn't be violating my duty of religious neutrality. It would be communicating my values to the public. Now, I think that's a really bad reason to turn down a development, especially during a housing crisis, but also in general. But that would be my prerogative to do that as a counselor, saying, hey, I'm moved by my personal faith to do X. At the same time, I couldn't then use the levers of the state to do Y. That's the difference. And so in this case, we have a situation where the state is effectively telling people, well, we want you to dress a certain way if you want to get a job. It's much more coercive as opposed to the just, we're not going to endorse any religions, let a thousand flowers bloom kind of situation.
Yeah, and so Quebec goes to try to operationalize that through the years with a number of laws and acts. The first one in 2017 was a mouthful of a title of a bill that I'll just use the English translation so I don't get yelled at for butchering it.
As a French
Is
speaker, I can jump in and say, la loi favorisant le respect de la neutralité religieuse de l'État et visant notamment à encadrer les demandes d'accommodement pour un motif religieux dans certains organismes. Yeah, take over, Annie, and that's
It's
about.
the act promoting respect for religious neutrality of the state and particularly regulating requests for accommodation for religious reasons in certain organizations. And we'll call it the Neutrality Act from now on of
Yes, we will.
2017. Basically, it tries to do two things. It tries to define what religious neutrality is and sets out some details for how to handle religious accommodation requests, which has been an ongoing debate in Quebec. Also, just a quick hi to the people from Calgary, Pouche Cove, Newfoundland, and Nanaimo, who are all watching
Hello,
along
friends.
as well. It's
We're
great to
glad to
see
have
so
you
many.
here.
Reminder, you can put your comments in the chat. Make sure to like the video. I think that helps our channel a little bit. Share it and go back and watch the whole discussion if you're just tuning in now.
And if
We're
you're just tuning in now, a joyous and neutral Neutrality Day to you. Today is Neutrality Day, our national holiday that celebrates the Saguenay decision. It's the 11th anniversary this year, and that's a decision that establishes that state has a duty of religious neutrality here in Canada. So, Ian, take us back to Quebec and the Neutrality Act. Now, when it's talking about religious accommodation, could you give me an illustrative example of what that is, just so we can kind of sink our teeth into something substantive here?
Yeah, this is someone saying I can't work on Friday because my religion has a holiday that day. It might be I can't eat I need to bring my own lunch to work because I won't eat for religious reasons, whatever is provided. It might involve head coverings and say, and that's been a more controversial one. I can't wear a helmet because I wear a turban, and court and tribunals have come down on different places on that. And in the Neutrality Act of 2017, it said uh, people could not cover their faces when receiving or providing public services. And that one got particularly controversial because it's saying the idea was to try to make sure identification happens and that there's a respect for one of the things that underlies the arguments for laïcité and the Québécois view is it's protecting women from religious coercion
Hmm.
who are being forced to veil. Now it's replacing the coercion of the church with the coercion of the state, which in our view isn't better.
Yeah, no, I always
Uh,
find that a bit tense where it's like, no, no, we are criticizing this religion for requiring people to dress a certain way, and we're going to require you to dress a different way. That seems deeply problematic in and of itself. I mean, to me, it would be dress how you want. Ideally, there's no coercion involved at all. You should probably wear pants or something, like when
yeah.
you're out in public or something like that. But beyond those kinds of basic requirements, you should be able to dress as you would. And especially when the state is intervening to prohibit certain types of religious clothing, then it becomes very problematic. I always find this interesting on the opposite side of things, where we often privilege religious head coverings, where people are allowed to wear religious head coverings in some circumstances. Like, for example, if you were to be a guest at the question time at Parliament, whereas if someone were to wear a hat out of personal preference or whatever reason, if it's not religious, those arguments are often seen as not as strong, and the person's required to take off their hat. I always find that an interesting tension, but in Quebec, it's now the opposite, where we're requiring people to remove their religious, face coverings or head coverings in order to, interact with the government or to work as a government employee. So that
And
Religious Neutrality Act, that was 2017, and that was a Liberal government that implemented.
yes,
Is that
and
correct?
they believed it was constitutional, so they did not invoke the notwithstanding clause. It was challenged by the National Council of Canadian Muslims and Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and they won an initial injunction, which was then going to go to further judicial review. But in that time, the Liberals lost the election to the Coalition Avenir du Québec, I believe, the CAQ, the CAQ, who introduced the Laïcité of the State Act, the Loi sur la laïcité de l'État,
And this is 2019.
in 2019. That's Bill 21. That's the one that includes the notwithstanding clause, and it goes further, right? And we don't need to get too detailed into that because one of the things that comes out of that is now we have two different laws defining secularism, laïcité in Quebec, touching on all these related issues. And that's just like fundamentally an issue, a
Hmm.
problem, right? When you have competing legislation trying to do the same thing. So in March 2025, the Quebec government sets up this committee of a couple legal experts to consult on this and to figure out where laïcité should go in the province and how to reconcile these two bills and what else should be done. And that committee does its consultation, it does its discussions, and towards the end of the year comes out with this comprehensive and interesting report, we think, on secularism and laïcité in Quebec with 50 recommendations. And what we've released today is our recommendation by recommendation analysis that followed from our discussions between you and I, as well as two bilingual board members, Therese Bullard and Adam Highway, where we just like sat down as a group and read through them a few times going, how can, do we like this? Do we not?
Hmm.
Was their justification good? Was their justification not? And I think on the whole, we actually agree with more recommendations than we disagree with. But the ones we disagree with, we really disagree with.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. We had some great conversations, and I think just for folks who are following along with the report, we have the original French text. I have high school French from French immersion, and so like I can speak French, but not French legalese. And so we had a great conversation around. We did some translations and made sure those made sense. We have a plain language summary for each one. We explain our position, and then we provide some rationale. Because as you were saying, Ian, some of these positions they make sense. They're great. Like there's some on maybe not giving out free tax money to places of worship without any kind of basis that you would give rather than not giving money to another organization that wasn't religious. Like that's something our organization has worked on for quite a long time. And there's some other ones on some of the clothing options and religious pressure that we would definitely disagree with. So as far as moving through the report, maybe we could talk very broadly about some of the first section looks at legislative coherence and constitutionality. Maybe Ian, you can take us a bit through that. Generally speaking, I think the first point here that you've already raised is just having two different sets of laws doesn't make a lot of sense. So a lot of the recommendations here are to bring, basically bring these two pieces of legislation together so that they're coherent, which I think is useful. Are there any ones in those early sort of seven recommendations that you would flag as ones that are ones that we'd like to see replicated across the country?
Yeah, I think like broadly, we're supportive of things that clean up the legislation, make it simpler, because even if we don't like it, you should be able to understand it as a citizen, as an organization, to know what your obligations and duties are. And it makes it easier to fight if you have to fight it, but you're not kind of governed by conflicting policies. One of the things that we flagged in this section, because we don't need to go too deep into this one, is there were a couple things, and this came up repeatedly throughout the report, where the committee wanted to essentially insulate the government from judicial scrutiny or
Hmm.
insulate laïcité to make it more difficult for courts to intervene or to provide injunctions. One of the recommendations, I don't have it right in front of me, but essentially said that courts shouldn't be able to enjoin a bill pending further review unless
Recommendation six, I think.
yeah, there
Yeah.
needs to be a much higher bar before an injunction could happen. Uh, Technically, what that means is broadly, if you sue the government because you say Bill whatever 17 is going to impact your rights, the courts already have a pretty well-established test for whether or not to say that bill can't be operational until we've debated it. Uh, they want to take what's already a substantial test and make it an almost impossible to pass test, which means the government would be free to run over your rights for years, potentially, until you could get that redress in the courts. And that just undermines the right of you as a citizen. And that kind of approach of insulation or raising the bar comes up again and again. It comes up around the religious accommodations that they want to
Mhm.
make harder in here. And we don't need to get into legal language, but they essentially promote changing the existing standard to a much higher untested one. And they ironically suggest this as a way to avoid legislative or judicial uncertainty and organizational uncertainty. But what it really means in practice is your bosses can mistreat you easier.
Well, and I was going to say just the counterpoint to that is recommendation three, where they're making it harder for this is a recommendation which says a written Quebec constitution should include an amendment procedure requiring a qualified majority to limit laicite and a simple majority to broaden the scope of laicite. So on one side we have efforts to make it harder for people to pursue issues through the courts, which I think, as you've eloquently explained, is not good. On the other hand, we have the government saying, well, if you're going to give people more, become more open and become more secular, that's easy. That's 50% majority. But if you're going to restrict people's ability, it's going to be a qualified majority or a two-thirds majority, which I think is useful. So yeah, that one is an example. Recommendation three, we support. But as you said, the recommendation six, when it's talking about civil procedures, that one is not so good because it delays judgments on constitutional issues and effectively makes it harder. The recommendation makes it harder to suspend laws that are challenged as unconstitutional.
I'm
And that's
also
where the problem
conscious
is.
of our time. We're coming up on the hour,
Oh yeah.
so time
Folks,
flies.
we've written like 800 or 900 pages about Saguenay now, as part of our Saguenay project, so we could get into this quite heavily. Actually, I will say, Ian, it's worth noting because today is Neutrality Day, but
I was
recommendation
about to
seven is to create a national day of laicite, which we've already done. So we can check that one off. Hopefully they will do April 15th. We'll see how that plays out. So the first section is a lot of just bringing the laws together, and as you've already mentioned, how can laws be challenged? I think the one that's got the most sort of the tofu and rice of the conversation is defining principles of laicite, effectively like codifying what we're actually talking about. You've already done a good job explaining the sort of open versus closed laicite. Maybe we can walk through some of the recommendations from recommendation eight and onward that kind of explore like how do we operationalize laicite in Quebec and how is it explained in this report? Are there any of
yeah,
those recommendations that jump out to you that you wanted to focus on?
like I really want to mention recommendation 9, that's to gradually phase out tax breaks and subsidies granted to religious organizations. It explicitly calls for repealing promotion of religion as a qualification for registered charities, something we've advocated on and are going to have a lot more to say about. It talks about eliminating tax exemptions and deductions, like for clergy and religious leaders. That's something we've raised in our work on the clergy residence deduction. And it also talks about those relating to municipal taxes, so property tax exemptions for places of worship, all things we've talked about. Now, it caveats that there should be a gradual elimination with possibly a transition fund for affected organizations. Fine. Not something we've raised, but I get politically why that could be
Yeah.
a pathway.
A lot of organizations like that will need some time to adjust. I think it's, as someone who ideally we wouldn't be funding some of these organizations, but it also seems a bit abrupt to cut off what can often be quite a lot of funding. The one I quite liked was recommendation 10, which is to phase out state funding for private religious schools. That's something else we've worked on. I know you've worked on a lot that yourself, where you have provincial money going to religious private schools. And when we look into these here in BC, we find some private schools, private religious schools are teaching some weird stuff. Like I remember in one of our past studies, we found examples of schools that prohibit dancing and celebrating Halloween and a whole host of other things. And so, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that the government shouldn't be directly funding schools that would overtly violate its duty of religious neutrality. Recommendation 10, I think, got two thumbs up from us, and
Yeah.
not a lot more explanation is needed on that. We have a whole report on public education, which I think is very useful. Are there any what about recommendation 11? That's one that is looking at, uh, well, now I'm trying to skim read it as we're talking here. Recommendation
It's a
11 was
mouthy
one that
one.
you'd flagged as one that was quite interesting.
It tries to define the principles of religious neutrality, and this gets into one of the questions we have that I'll come back to in a second. And most of this is pretty good, but it also talks about um, the display or symbol
Right.
implying personal expression or dress is an endorsement by the state of religion. And we argue that that overreaches essentially. And this is what we've come back to. And so our question in the chat is kind of the converse challenge to this is don't you have the right to be served by someone who doesn't show a religion, perhaps if you've been traumatized by religion?
And the religious symbolism here is also interesting because I think there's a distinction, and again, this is kind of made in discussion a bit, but like, what is it religious symbolism or display? Like, one, if I'm wearing a necklace for my faith, is that a display? No, it's symbolism, but is it, if it's on my person, that's clearly different than if we set up a little shrine at the side of the check-in office at the DMV, right? Like, I think there's a distinction that's being drawn there, which I think is one that needs to be felt out, sussed out a bit more, particularly when it's like individual, again, back to our previous point on individual practice of religion versus the state endorsement, right? If the state's endorsing things like having a shrine set up next to a check-in office or having a display, or I think example we've talked about is like a nativity scene on top of City Hall. That's not
Well,
okay.
the committee gives a few examples of what they consider is not okay versus an okay situation. So the things they are concerned about are municipalities erecting menorahs, which is something we would raise. A
Hmm.
daycare including nativity figurines. That's a little less serious, but I get it. I get
Yeah.
the concern there. And then they say a company allowing a staff member to wear religious clothing in company colors, which I don't understand the concern with. Like,
Yeah,
just I
that's the
can't.
one that targets the individual as opposed to like the structural. There's another one actually, just to jump ahead because I'm watching the time as well. Although we can go a little bit longer here, friends, and this is a good opportunity to remind people if you do have any questions, please pop them in the comments there. Ian will relay them to me over here as well. And also a neutrality day to all folks who are joining us and from across the country. Recommendation 13 was another one, which I think is really interesting because it speaks to the kind of idea that neutrality, when it's this closed neutrality, is a sort of forced homogenization where it talks about prohibiting in the future, the erection or affixing of new religious signs or emblems on state monuments. And this is interesting because effectively you're saying, okay, we're drawing a line. Today is the day we stop building any or adding any new religious signs or emblems to state monuments. But we're going to let all the previous state monuments stand. And I think that's the issue. Now, I'm glad that the cross has been removed from the L'Assemblée nationale in Quebec. But ultimately, you're saying, well, we've got this sort of this very Catholic Christian heritage here in Quebec. That's our baseline. Nothing new is allowed to be added to it. And I think that also underscores a bit of a challenge, which is we want to support that. Like obviously going forward, we shouldn't be adding new religious symbolism to state monuments, but we may also need to look back as well. And so I think that one's an interesting one where it kind of speaks to we're not operating in a vacuum. There is a baseline, and the baseline is one that often favors one religion over others. And it creates these interesting tensions, which we have to then navigate.
Yeah, the other one I'll note out of here, and then we could probably skim through the rest of this report before we close off. Recommendation 14 was a really weird one because it calls for the banning of religious symbols on posters and advertisements of government and
Mhm.
public institutions, except in certain places. And so there are two versions of this. The government, I should think we all agree, should not be putting up a giant sign or letter to constituents like the Alberta Education Minister did that endorses Christianity or Islam or anything and implies that's what the government is. But there's ample amounts of public service announcements that simply try to reflect what the
Yeah.
people of the population look like. And maybe it's a discussion of like, hey, go get vaccinated. And are they saying we shouldn't have a person wearing a hijab in this pro-vaccine poster? Because that's how I read this.
Yeah, and this kind of representation is actually really important to let people know that they belong in our communities. I remember the reason why Subarus are a favorite car of lesbians, or at least this is the line is, of course, they were introducing the company Subaru was introducing advertisements that were sort of subtly advertising marketing to lesbian couples in the 90s. And we, as a municipality, are this is probably a better example, I think. Our municipality is working to make sure that we take photos of people around the district to use in our reports, to use in our websites that reflect the diversity of our community. And we wouldn't want to erase a certain group of people because they had religious symbols and they wore them. I think that's actually quite the opposite. You know, it's actually quite harmful where you say, oh, anyone with overt religious symbols doesn't belong here. That's a very negative and dangerous message to spread, and we often want to see that the diversity of our community reflected in government publications. So yeah, I think that one is one of those ones where you can see the benefit of like don't advertise religion through the state, but also we have to reflect the diversity of our community, which has religious people and people from non-majoritarian faith traditions, and those people should often be reflected in just group photos or imagery used by the state. I think it actually undermine it makes things less effective. Like if you look at some of the work done on women in STEM, trying to get young women and girls involved in, engineering and sciences, it's really helpful to have a role model to look up to, someone that you can actually see yourself in that practice. There's a company that manufactures children's toys for children with special medical devices, so they can have a teddy bear with a colostomy bag, or a teddy bear that has, a blood sugar detector on it, and it makes them feel seen and reflected in their toys, and that is really great for a kid. And I'm probably waxing too poetic on this, but I think it's important that the state not be erasing people from its communications just because those people may have religious symbolism as part of on their person.
I know you've done a lot of work on reproductive health, and there's three recommendations in here touching on that. Recommendation 22, as well as 38 and 39. And so I wanted to turn those over to you. Number 22 says they will end the practice of writing to parents of students to inform them in advance that sexuality related content will be taught to their children. Well, 38 and 39, I believe, say they won't fund anti-choice groups anymore, and they will, what is it, require to do ensure that public health establishments respect their obligations to offer abortion care with rigorous follow-up from the minister.
This is really important. Yeah, so as Ian, as you're mentioning, I'm in addition to my BC Humanist hat and other hats, I'm also the chair and co-founder of Access BC. We're a grassroots campaign that fights for reproductive justice and got free contraception here in British Columbia. Shameless plug, I suppose. Like and subscribe. But as a result, I do live in the world of doing a lot of work on reproductive justice. And yes, speaking to recommendation 22 in particular, asking parents the kind of opt-in versus opt-out approach, I think, is really important. Having good sex education that's judgment-free, that's ones that's presented, that's up to date, that's neutral, neutral. I'm bringing neutral language in here. It's judgment-free, it's up to date, and it's comprehensive, and it's also age-appropriate, of course, is really important for young people to have a baseline of knowledge, right? And so when you have something that's like, oh, here's a scary opt-in form that's going home to let parents know they're having sex ed in the classroom, that actually increases the number of kids who are being pulled out. And those kids, the kind of parent who's likely to pull their kid out of that program is the kind of kid that probably needs that program because they're being shielded from basic health information. We're talking about age appropriate sex ed. That includes things like menstruation and that, basic, puberty and like growing bodies and all sorts of different age appropriate content. That's, I think, really important. And, obviously, if parents have strong opinions about these things, they can still pull their children out of their programs. But by sending forms home to parents, you're flagging this as an issue. But we don't flag, science classes and say, hey, parents, if you're a flat earther, you might want to know we're doing astronomy next week. And your kid's going to learn that the Earth is a globe. Make sure you sign a consent form to have the kid learn about a globe. That would be absolutely bonkers. And similarly, we wouldn't say, if any parents have really strong opinions about pronouns, we're doing English class next week. In fact, we're doing English class every week. Pronouns will be mentioned. If you're upset about those, sign a consent form. So I think that's worth mentioning. But when it comes to anti-choice funding, you and I have seen this quite a lot. The BC Humanist Association has partnered with the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada to do a couple of research reports investigating crisis pregnancy centers, also known as unregulated pregnancy centers. And these are organizations that are set up to overtly engage in motivated counseling. So folks may have seen those ads out there, like from Birthright or something like that. Like, are you scared? Are you pregnant? Are you scared? We can help. The answer is they can't. They're designed to try to dissuade people from choosing an abortion, and these entities are religiously motivated. And what we've actually found is some of them are very good at concealing their motivations, such that they receive government funding or even partner with government agencies, as we saw with Fraser Health last year, that the BCHA was instrumental in ending. And so what we see is government funding sometimes going to support these groups that undermine fundamental rights, rights that are included in the Canadian Charter, but also in the Quebec human rights legislation as well. And when it comes to public health, the BCHA has done a lot of work on this as well with like religious hospitals here in British Columbia, where you see public funding going to religious hospitals that don't provide MAID, medical assistance in dying, and do not provide abortion or sometimes maybe not refer for abortion. And this has led to some horrific situations where patients who are seeking to end their lives in a humane and dignified way have to be relocated to other hospitals, or people won't get access to actual healthcare because obviously abortion is healthcare. And so I think those are really strong recommendations because we really shouldn't see public money going to these entities, and it's one of the ones that we'd like to see, replicated across the country. So it's one of those interesting reports where we see some points which are like, yes, two thumbs up, strongly support. We shouldn't be giving tax exemptions to organizations just because they're religious. We shouldn't be funding religious hospitals because they restrict access to, or if they restrict access to, basic medical services. And similarly, we shouldn't be undermining pedagogical approaches to good sex ed. But at the same time, we also see some tension where the legislation is trying to force people to remove their religious paraphernalia or clothing in order to work for a government or engage with government, and that also becomes very problematic.
Yeah, and there's so much in there, right? One of the reasons I think those recommendations on abortion access and human sexual health education is so important is it does tie in that laïcité or secularism is more than just simply when government is obviously praying, right? Religion has a lot of influences on public policy. And the argument we're bringing forward, for example, in the O'Neill case, which is the case challenging abortion access at St. Paul, or medical assistance in dying access, I should say, at St. Paul's Hospital in downtown Vancouver, is that the government has essentially allowed religion to dictate your healthcare through this contracting out of public services. And that undermines their duty of religious neutrality, right? They're allowing Catholic bishops on the board of Providence Healthcare to dictate what services you can access. And that shouldn't be okay. If an individual wants to have an assisted death or abortion, that is their choice based on many different, things, including possibly their religious beliefs. But the state, on whether or not it should be able to make that choice, like shouldn't be based on one particular religious view. That's the coercion we're talking about.
One of the ones, just to jump on that, Ian, briefly, because I'm conscious of our time, but I think it's worth noting, is I'm looking at recommendation 45, where it talks about prayer rooms, right? And I think this is the solution here, and the reason why we support that recommendation in particular, kind of, I think, really helps encapsulate what you were describing, which is we recognize that human experience sometimes requires a space to reflect. And we just finished working on a report on this around chaplaincy. But basically, having a room where people can spend some time to either, to escape sensory issues if they're, maybe if that's an issue for them, or room to reflect, or room to pray in, that's really important. But of course, having a prayer room that is designed like a church chapel says you're not welcome here unless you're a Christian or you're of the specific religious sect. So I was looking at those kinds of elements of like there's ways that the state can accommodate a wide range of people of diverse backgrounds and perspectives that doesn't violate its duty of religious neutrality, right? And for example, of healthcare, you can say like if you oppose abortion, don't have one, as opposed to not allowing them to be performed in a publicly funded hospital. If you need a space to pray, we can provide you with a space to pray, but that's also a space that other people can use to have low sensory experience, or can use for meditation, or can use to read quietly in the corner. And I think that's also really important to create a space that accommodates a wider range of folks as opposed to just accommodating one small, narrow band of people in that respect.
Yeah, and that's one of the other broad issues we came back to a couple times in this report is the choice of language also came up for us. The French is a weird language, right? Because it's gendered, and so there is a lot of he and her, or
Yeah, il, elle, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Even the chair, like
But
la chaise, le chaise, it's all it gets. Yeah.
But in a lot of cases, it's trying to recognize the equality of men and women. But we note that that can exclude trans and gender nonconforming individuals who have equal rights and often face greater persecution from religious hierarchies. And also, this report weirdly chooses to use the word citizen in the French translation rather than all people in many cases. So
Mm.
Quebec citizens would have these rights rather than residents in Quebec or people within Quebec. And the Canadian Charter is very clear that it's except on voting rights, pretty much everyone has the rights under the Charter. Uh, your
And
freedom of
there's been
religion, yeah, your freedom of religion
yeah.
doesn't depend on your citizenship status, and it shouldn't.
Yeah, no, I was going to say there's been some court rulings on that, which I think was Tam v. Governor of British Columbia, or there was a federal case as well, where that becomes important because just because you aren't a citizen doesn't mean that you don't have these fundamental rights, and that's really important. Ian, I'm watching the time. Maybe you could give a bit of a summative comment on our Laïcité report. For those of you who have stuck it out to the end, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. It is Neutrality Day, and we are recognizing Neutrality Day in the best way possible with a classic live stream exploring our most recent report, which is Lost in Translation from Laïcité to True Religious Neutrality. It's now up on the BC Humanist Association website in all 57 pages of its glory. We go through each of the recommendations in Quebec from the Quebec report and talk about them. And as Ian mentioned, the BCHA supports some of them, has some concerns about others, actively opposes other ones in there. It's well worth diving into because this is not just a report that exists in a vacuum. It's actively changing and shaping our province, our country rather. We saw examples in Quebec, but we also see examples in Alberta, as we noted earlier on in our conversation around some of their efforts to introduce air quotes neutrality into classrooms. And we've also seen this in the Saguenay decision talking about neutrality in municipal council chambers, prohibiting prayer from opening those council meetings, and some of our other efforts. So maybe as far as the Laïcité report, Ian, what would your biggest takeaways be for that? If someone was doesn't have, if it's TLDR, what would
Yeah.
you say people should take away from that report?
Like the first thing I want to just emphasize is I'm really glad to see a province diving into this. The committee on laïcité that wrote this report was actually empowered to do something really cool, right? They were empowered to talk about secularism and laïcité to the people, to discuss it, to figure out what's working, what's not, to listen to stories. We think, we have lots of different criticisms, but just that process is something I think we would love to see more provinces and federal governments, even if we don't agree entirely with the end results. These discussions are important, right? And I don't think we have enough of them in English Canada. We just kind of pretend we're in this like secular multicultural state. And oh, Mark Carney's just at the National Prayer Breakfast, and that's just fine because why shouldn't he get to go to it? It's a private event, but it wasn't a fully private event, right? We need to have these discussions to get a proper understanding. So that's a fantastic opportunity that Quebec is leading the country on. Our concern, of course, is that they are weaponizing it and overreaching in so many cases where they take the positives of the duty of religious neutrality and extend it into a forced coercion, right? We get there's a history there that's unique, but even when we look at polling over time on these issues, it's not unanimous. Quebec has never been a unanimous province where they believe that this kind of closed secularism is necessary. In fact, some of the early polling on even Bill 21 proved it was controversial in Quebec. And so this isn't the white Anglo former Protestants or ex-Protestants trying to dictate, but we're trying to really understand why this approach is necessary in Quebec when there is a more inclusive multicultural option on the table. And that's our big concern. And I think the other big concern is that the oppressive elements of this create a backlash to secularism more broadly. I
Mm.
saw this in some of the discussions last year where someone had brought the idea of a Religious Neutrality Day proclamation to the city. I think it was a Esquimalt. I realized I hadn't held up our
Oh yeah,
Vancouver
we have to
one.
celebrate. For those who are watching, this is our declaration. This is from Vancouver, then, Ian.
Yep, this is from Mayor Ken Sim.
And which other municipalities have endorsed formally this year? I know last year we had a few other
We got
proclamations.
Toronto and Ottawa last year, and we got Ottawa again this year. But last year we had this conversation in Esquimalt where someone had put it forward, and I saw in the community Facebook groups people decried it, and they actually went to council to decry the idea of proclaiming it religious neutrality because they say this is the racist Quebec approach to it. And our emphasis in the text, which is on our website of that proclamation, is that religious neutrality is about protecting and promoting the multicultural heritage of this country. And that's what comes from the Saguenay decision. So it's not a word we want to cede, right? There are sometimes things can get weaponized, like the word woke has fully disconnected from its origins. There's lots of other words like that, but neutrality and religious neutrality is the Canadian concept of secularism, and it's one we think there's value in and defending.
And as the Saguenay decision, which we are celebrating its 11th anniversary, says, this is a democratic imperative. This isn't just a nice to have, it's fundamental, as you've well articulated, for the functioning of our state. Everyone should be welcome at meetings. Everyone should be welcome to express themselves in the way that they deem fit, whether that's non-religious or religious. I think that's a really good way of summarizing the conversation. Now, we have a bit of homework for folks out there today. One is if you support the work that we do, please consider donating to support the BC Humanist Association. Join us. We are having community events all the time. Our research team is always looking for volunteers. We have research projects that involve sometimes just poking at data quietly in the corner, or sometimes actively writing reports and everything in between. And keep up to date with our work. We've got this report coming out. We've got another report coming out at the end of the month, which is on our Saguenay project for New Brunswick. And we'll be having reports coming out for other provinces that we're mopping up as we move across the country with that. And the BC Human Association, we punch well above our weight, Ian. I think this is always quite impressive. I think it was last year, we declared it was last year. Yeah, that's right. Last year, we declared BC unconstitutional prayer free in municipalities, thanks to our advocacy work. We went from 26 municipalities that opened their inaugural meetings in 2018 with prayer down to 0. We will be checking at the end of the elections this October just to make sure that all those municipalities did what they said they would do. But ultimately, the work that we do is making a difference. And these conversations that we're having and the conversations that you were flagging, Ian, about like how do we have a secular society in Canada, not just in Quebec, but across the country, those are conversations worth having and ones that are live in our society today. And the BC Humanist Association is at the forefront of those conversations, and I'm proud to be part of the team.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who is listening and watched this. I hope you take the time to go back and watch it if you haven't. I have to make sure when I click end stream that it doesn't cut off 5 seconds of my video or
We will
so
do well.
long.
We will end with a 1, 2, 3 Happy Neutrality Day. So
Yeah,
1, 2, 3 Happy
happy
Neutrality Day,
neutrality day.
friends.